high engagement in a particular market would indicate that you are running a successful localization program.
Hello and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, translation, and global communication. I'm Caterina from Undertow, and today Nicola Calabrese, our founder, is diving into an insightful conversation about metrics. Our guest today is Julio Leal, head of localization at Spendesk. With almost 20 years of experience under his belt, Julio possesses a singular background that grants him insights from both ends of the localization chain. His expertise lies in different aspects of the localization, including market research, competitor analysis, and development of a minimal viable product to test market viability. His extensive knowledge ensures that the localization efforts are not only effective, but also in line with the company's goals. So, without delay, let's jump right into the conversation.
Hi, Julio, and welcome again to the Multilingual Content Podcast. Thank you for joining us again.
Hey, Nicola. Great to be here again. Yeah, looking forward to resuming our conversation where we left it off.
Yeah, so for whoever is joining us just for the second part, in the first part, we talked about, in general, how to start a localization program within a software as a service startup. And in this second part, we're going to dig deeper into the metrics that matter in SaaS localization, so localization for the software as a service field. And before we jump into the topic, Julio, would you mind briefly tell a little bit about yourself, your experience, your background?
I've been fortunately in the localization business for almost 20 years, working both for agencies and translation companies, helping corporations with their translation and localization requirements. And, the second half of my career went into the corporate world, helping companies either, setting up localization teams or growing and scaling up the translation program. So I have experience on both sides of the supply chain.
Yeah, and you have a especially experience on the SaaS business. That's why what you're currently doing at Spendesk, correct?
Exactly. Right now, I'm leading the translation and localization program at Spendesk, French spend management software as a service company, where we help small and medium enterprises across Europe with their spend management. And it's a pretty recent company, which was established in France, and they are gradually moving into new markets. And that's where the localization program comes in to help in the product and content localization efforts.
And speaking about the SaaS, the software as a service industry, what do you think sets it apart from any other industry when it comes to measuring the localization success?
Well, to me, I think that based on my experience, the main differentiator based on other company is how important product localization is compared to other internal or content types that you might have within the company. Meaning that everything around product is the key differentiator, and that's where you need to focus most of your efforts. And the positive side of that is that many metrics that are hidden in other industries, like for instance, I've been running translation and localization programs where marketing was probably the biggest stakeholder, where most of the efforts were put in. However, we were not able to track many of the metrics to measure the success or failure of the program. With software as a service, that's a key difference, because you can actually measure real time what's the impact of any new languages, new features that you are launching. And that's a big difference, because you can actually pivot any efforts or any programs that you are running just to make sure that your effort is fully aligned with the user expectations and the user preference. So there is a very small gap between the users and your reaction to the user preferences.
And yeah, that's actually quite a big difference compared to sometimes marketing, where it's difficult to understand exactly, assess basically all the different pieces of content, what they retain to you, what kind they contribute. And when you talk about like in specific, what are the metrics that you think that are most relevant for assessing whether is a success or not the localization effort of SaaS products in different international markets?
Well, I think the metrics may be different for each industry. So you may be looking at different metrics. And it also depends on where in the localization journey your company is, because obviously you might not be looking at the same metrics when you are entering a new market and when you are very mature in the market, right? So you will be looking at different metrics just to see, how your entry is going or how your behavior in that market is going. A few metrics that come to mind are, for instance, user engagement metrics, and this would include daily active users and monthly active users, for instance, for each of the localized versions. High engagement in a particular market would indicate that you are running a successful localization program. You could also be looking at session duration, pages per session, etc. Another metric to consider would be conversion rates, measuring the conversion from visitor to user. And that's quite critical, especially if you are trying to turn free users into paid users. So obviously, you could actually measure if from the moment you start localizing your product, there is a higher rate for that conversion. So from the moment you started localizing your product, you can see that more and more users are moving into paid users. Back to what I said earlier, once you are more mature in the market, most of the metrics will go into customer retention and churn rates. And these are very crucial in the SaaS industry because you want to make sure that your customer web base is happy and that they are happy with the product, that you are able to anticipate their needs, that you are always one step ahead of what they need, and that you are able to listen to their requirements, right? At this level, I think that, having a close analysis of the support tickets trends just to see the nature of those tickets, they might be related to things that are specifically about translation and localization. Maybe your product is not fully adapted or, very usual cases where, you need to enter your name or you need to enter your personal details. And sometimes the fields that you need to fill out might not be adapted to your locale. So many of these things will come through support tickets because sometimes they might not be able to log in or sign in just because the interface of your product is not ready for these new locales. So that's where, by keeping track of those support tickets, you make sure that the localization effort is fully aligned with how the product is evolving in those markets. Last but not least, also related to customer feedback, you can also measure the customer satisfaction and the net promoter score, feedback and reviews. Make sure that whoever is at the very front of the customer interaction, that you get frequent feedback, and either if it's customer support, field marketers, revenue, whatever, it's crucial that you have very frequent and open conversation with these teams because they will be able to transmit and let you know what are the biggest concerns around localization from your existing users.
And sorry, what about, maybe you mentioned that I missed it, but what about in case there's like sales rep, like people actually going, especially in a B2B scenario, when there's like actually do demos, what kind of metrics might be interesting there to look at?
Well, obviously, if you have users that have been going through a demo process, it's clear that they are quite interested in your product. Obviously, they already fill out the details and they are willing to spend some time going through the demo with the account executives. In my experience, this is very critical because demos will probably present a very real case or very close to real scenario of your product. And I'm actually, especially for Spendesk, for instance, I can tell you that we get a lot of feedback about localization from the interactions that onboarding managers and account executives have with the users that are considering the acquisition of the product. So things that might not be translated properly, things that are totally out of context. Maybe when they are just filling out all the details, clients can feel that there is something off there. So actually the teams go back to you, say, hey, we need to fix this, because when we are presenting the team, when we are presenting the product to prospects, there is something off, and that might be blocking new users from getting into customers, right? So we need to make sure that all that feedback is looped back into the localization program so we can fix it.
And regarding about the collecting that feedback, is it something like ad hoc in the sense like maybe the accounting notice something and it mentions it to you? Or do you have like something more, let's say, structured, like a regular meeting or regular report? It's something similar to the ticketing system you might have with support.
Yeah, it can be both. Depends on the nature and the structure of the company, but we have a ticket system for, let's say, major issues in which, for instance, an account executive is going through a demo with a prospect, and at a certain point, the interface is totally in English and it's not localized. So that's a very big red flag, and that's not something that needs to be fixed immediately. So that would go through a ticket system to make sure that is fixed, but at the same time that we keep track of this, but we prevent these issues from happening again. But also we have Slack channels where we communicate frequently, and this kind of feedback may not be that formal. It's more informal, like, hey, I got a sense in my conversation with the customer that this could be translated differently, or that we should be changing or adapting this screen and this step in the process just because, doesn't work well in this language, right? So I think it's good to have these two levels of feedback, something that is positive and might be nice to have and nice to implement, but at the same time, you may have other big problems that need to be fixed immediately and need to be, dealt with more consideration.
And regarding in general, like measuring the ROI of SaaS localization efforts, sorry, a little bit about it in the first part. Can you give like more details? Like once you have a program up and running, what kind of things would you keep an eye on, and what kind, let's say, of maybe dashboards or documentation reports you put together to show basically also to stakeholders, not only when you start, which is what we talked about last time, but more like once you have it up and running, like to show, let's say, 6 months down the line, this is the results we're getting. This is the return on investment on what we did. Like, this is worth in this market. Maybe in this one doesn't make sense to expand it. How would you go about it? What kind of, like, let's say, dashboard reports, documentation would you put together, and what data you think it's most important to look for?
Yeah. So obviously, as a first step, without any doubt, would be establishing a baseline, right? So before you begin any localization effort, I think it's very important to have a clear understanding of your current performance metrics. So this would include your user base, engagements level, conversion rates, and revenue, for instance, in each of the target markets. So this baseline would allow you to measure the incremental impact of your localization efforts. So to me, one of the most straightforward metrics is revenue growth in the localized markets. So I would compare the revenue before and after localizations. Any increase can be partially attributed to your localization efforts, especially if the other market conditions have remained relatively constant, meaning that if you see that the more you invest in localization, the more growth you have in that market, but all the other efforts have remained constant, like, I don't know, sales, support, it's clear that, the localization is playing a very important role in the growth in that specific market. Also, another thing would be analyzing user acquisition and engagement. And that would be around looking how the localization affects your user acquisition rates and user engagements in all these different markets. Metrics would be around sign-up rates, active users, session duration, feature usage, to see what features are more relevant in what markets and being able to customize those for those specific locales. If there is a noticeable uptick in these metrics post-localization, is a strong indication of you getting ROI for that localization effort. I would also look into the cost analysis. What are the total cost of your localization efforts? And this would include all your direct costs around translation and localization, how much you are paying your vendors for the translation services, how much you are paying for additional help or the technology that you are using to run the program. But it would also include indirect costs, such as the training that you need to provide in order to have all the program running. Also important at the very early stages of the program, everything around market penetration is critical. So you should be able to assess how your market share has changed in those localized regions and see if after your localization efforts, you are getting significant increase in your share in those markets. So that would also be a clear indicator that ROI is there, right? That you are getting a high return on your investment. So I think that all these things are important to be able to start showing the value of the localization. And as we discussed in our previous conversation, prove the localization program as a revenue enabler rather than a cost center. And I think that the most critical step for that is starting with the baseline, making sure that you are keeping track of absolutely everything so you can measure the before and after. How were things before you started the localization program? What was your impact? What were the local users? What was the interaction with your product in those key markets? And what happens after that localization effort? And I think that is critical that you measure absolutely everything, because metrics that you think that might not be relevant at a certain point might become very relevant at a later stage, just because the maturity of your program is evolving. The markets also get more mature, and the things that you were not looking maybe 2 years ago might become more relevant 2 years later. So I think that is critical that data becomes your ally at all times.
And regarding the, let's say, showing, presenting this to stakeholders, is it something like you do on a regular basis, as needed basis, or is something like you have a shared dashboard and then everybody can look at? Or any advice you would give around this, like about communicating the value over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your job as, localization manager is not just running the program, is also showing the value of the program. So I keep track of these metrics on a daily basis. I may be checking some metrics on a weekly basis. I touch base with, my manager maybe every 2 weeks to make sure that key metrics are fully aligned with what the whole department is looking at. And we may be showing this data to more higher level executives, maybe once, twice a year, with the aim of making sure that what we are doing on the localization program is, again, fully aligned where the company wants to go. So, for instance, the company is fully focused on specific markets because that's where the company believes the growth is for this year. It's very critical that when you are presenting your data, you are showing that your localization efforts are focused on these markets, that you are investing there with translation efforts, that your quality is improving, making sure that, the feedback from these markets is considered and that you are implementing whatever critical changes need to be implemented. So it would be a mix of showing the data with a message, making sure that everything is fully aligned. And at the same time, it's also very important that you are able to provide recommendations, right? Because obviously there is always some room for improvement, and you may need to actually be the advocate for new trends and new tools in your programs. For instance, if you see that your TMS, that there are new capabilities and new functionalities that could be adding value to your program, it's important that you add those things to your conversation with executive. You may have 2-3 times opportunities along the year to talk to relevant stakeholders. So it's critical that you use that time to make sure that you are heard.
And do you have some example, because you mentioned briefly about this, of like localization metrics and in general the localization efforts, how it might have influenced like product development or feature prioritization? Is it something that you have seen, that you see often, you've never seen it, but it could be?
Well, I've seen where the localization is providing changes on the product. Is that the question?
Yeah, so to understand if it's like, in one way you said that the business decide we go in their market, but at the same time, if it's like it is a feedback loop in the sense that maybe from the market and from the localization point of view, you see like users in that specific market, you mentioned as well, like feature usage, you might notice actually from what we see also from localization metrics, they mostly, even if we localize everything, they keep going to this feature, to this functionality. So feed it back to the, let's say, whoever take the decision about where to take the business?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few examples on that. And I can tell you that the localization influence can happen before and after the localization per se happens, right? Or takes place, because if the localization program is involved in the earliest stages of product development, you should be able to raise your voice and provide feedback whenever you see that some product features are not localization ready or localization friendly. So you need to make sure to anticipate whatever adjustments and changes need to happen before they are presented to the users and customers, right? So I can tell you a couple of examples of cases where, we were able to impact the product after it was released to the users. And it was about when we were tracking the user engagement metrics in different markets. We discovered that users in Germany, they were spending significantly more time on specific features compared to users in other locales. So this insight led the product team to prioritize enhancements to this feature for the German market to make sure that we were able to suit the local preferences better. So that meant that we created and developed specific features and functionalities because we saw from the user interaction with the product that was extremely relevant for that market, just because the legal system is different or the financial regulation is different. Obviously, maybe the users of your product in certain market might be more concerned about certain functionalities. So we were able to kind of customize certain features for a specific market. We were also being able to make some adjustments to the user interface based on feedback we received from the users, right? And this feedback came through customer support, indicating that, the navigation within the app was a bit confusing because we kind of created a standardized way of creating the app at that point. But for certain region and markets, it was a bit confusing. We realized by analyzing all these tickets that we were dealing with some cultural issues here, in the sense that the hierarchy of the information was not equally perceived. So what we had to do is create a different hierarchy for our product, for our app, to make it more user-friendly for that specific region, because they kind of mentally had a different way of thinking on how to move through the app. And we're aware that the way that users in one region were using or were navigating through the app in a different way. So we have to kind of adapt the navigation in the app in a different way, just to make sure that our users in all the different regions feel totally comfortable with how they navigate, regardless of their location. So all these things happen by, as I said earlier, having open communication and being able to have a support ticket and support answer from the customer support to make sure that all that relevant feedback is incorporated feedback. Because if you are receiving all that information and you are not able to react quickly to that feedback, you are getting behind, and those users might not provide very good, advertising or good news about your product. So it's critical that you are able to adapt and implement those changes as soon as possible.
And it makes absolute sense, since the localization is always looking into the different markets as well. You're in the market basically. So it's easier for you as well, to be on top of spotting any pattern that might come out from the metrics that you're measuring. And it's always around metrics and analytics. How do you assess the scalability and efficiency of the localization process through metrics? Is there any way to measure that your or metrics that you should keep an eye on to make sure that your localization program is running efficiently, and if it needs to be scaled up, it's not gonna, let's say, it's gonna keep up with the pace? Is there something metric wise that you should keep an eye on, or something you need to measure sometimes might be underestimated?
Well, to me, metric number one would be time to market. So basically, how long you need as a company from the moment you decide to go into one market requiring a specific language until you actually launch in that market, right? So obviously, in the earlier stages of your product, needing to learn everything, trying to create more synergies across the teams, the time to market may be longer, but it's good that you make all these new entries as a learning exercise to make sure so you can learn how to become faster and faster in time. So you streamline all the processes. So the next time you move into a new market or your company decides to move into a new market, that time to market, it's as minimal as possible, right? So because that will create, an advantage to your company, a competitive advantage compared to other product where your users might be going. So the faster you become, the better for your product. Also, the localization cost, right? So it's important that whenever you add new languages, that you are able to scale and use many of your processes and tools that you currently have, and that adding new languages doesn't mean like a huge incremental cost to your entire program. It's obvious that you will have new translation costs and you will have new operating costs for that specific language, but that shouldn't mean that for every new language or for any new region that you want to incorporate into your language mix means like a substantial growth of your localization budget. The same can be told about quality and resource. The more efficient you become and the more agile you become, you'll be able to leverage most of the quality metrics and resources that you have been using for your previous languages. At a certain point of your localization program, you should be able to assess and measure all the costs that would be associated with implementing new languages into your product. And that should not be a surprise. So, right? So if you are now doing 10 languages and next year you want to incorporate 5 new languages, by the way everything is set up, you should be able to very accurately assess how much investment and how much money your company needs to put into the localization program to incorporate those languages. So you can only do that by, creating a very scalable and efficient process. And to do that, as we said on a previous question, make sure that you are measuring all the relevant metrics and analytics.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And this links back to what we discussed in part one as well. Like, that's why it makes sense to start small and then grow up by build on top of it rather than go all in and let's launch 10 languages all at the same time, launch with a new system, because you have a lot of things to figure out. Even if you plan, there will be adjustments you will have to do along the way. So it makes absolute sense. And yeah, systemize everything, makes a system out of it. It makes absolute sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And we discussed in our previous conversation, about creating the minimum product, right? Viable to make sure that, the effort is minimum. At least you can launch something out there. You call it experience, right? So
yeah, we call it minimum viable experience. So because it looks at the whole user experience from the, let's say, brand awareness to, let's say, renewal, referral, because that's so you launch small in the sense like less markets, but you do it properly with the minimum experience there. And then that allows you to test, to measure, see what works, what doesn't, both internally and externally, because you see as well, like internally, maybe there's some readjustment you need to do, like the way you, sometimes like maybe you have a workflow for doing some things internally and you might need to adjust it a little bit because you realize it will be more efficient once you need to scale up to, let's say, what you do for just one market. The very simple thing like you're doing content creating in English, you can follow workflow, but you realize when you start having 2-3 languages, that there might be small tweaks that you can do here and there that will make it more scalable. And then switching from 2 languages to 4 is not as difficult as from 1 to 2 or 3. So there's like a learning journey as well, like all along the way.
Yeah, you can also apply that to technology that you incorporate into your program in the sense that, hey, maybe you are not 100% sure about what TMS is the right fit for you. So, hey, spend some time testing different TMSs out there. No need to go for one from day one. There are a lot of good choices right there. And sometimes it's very hard to know what's the right fit for your company. So, fortunately, most of these options have like demo versions and you can use these tools for free for a period of time. So use that time to see if these TMSs can, adapt to your needs, can add languages very fast, see how they work. And, it's a low risk. And that's the only way to make sure that at least you have something and you don't have to take high risks at this point.
Yeah. And also like it is a little bit less overwhelming if you do it little by little rather than jump with both feet in. Yeah. And Is there anything else that maybe we didn't discuss about metrics and software as a service, localization? Do you think it's worth, or some like additional advice maybe that you would like to give to somebody either at the start or when they already launched a localization program?
Yeah, I would say that you are responsible for keeping track of as many metrics as possible, but then you should be able to wise these metrics wisely, right? Whenever you have these touch-up points or important meetings with stakeholders like, I don't know, marketing, product, etc., make sure that you use the relevant metrics for those stakeholders. Don't use sales-oriented metrics for marketing, or don't use non-relevant metrics for executives, right? They will be looking at different things, each of them, right? So you need to be able to tailor your metrics, your message, your story for each of these target audiences. So, the more metrics and the more data you compile, the wider the choice you will have when trying to customize this message and these presentations, right? So I think that's very important, because I've seen from personal experience not presenting the most relevant data to the audience. And sometimes things could have gone better or faster if I would have been able to provide more relevant data to that specific audience. So I think that is also very important. It's just not the data, it's how you present the data and which data you present to whom. And I think that comes with experience, making sure that you understand what your audience needs at that point.
And I mean, I know in a way it's linked to what we discussed in the first part, but like regarding this, how would you recommend somebody to understand better the kind of metrics that each different stakeholder, let's say what marketing will be looking at, what executives will be looking at, what product will be? Is there any recommendation we'll give on how to understand better that?
Yeah, I think it's all down to engage with these teams as much as possible. Attend their meetings, attend their product meetings. So I try to attend as many product meetings as possible. Sometimes I will not understand 70% of the conversation. Sometimes it will be 90%. But that will help me understand what they are worried about, what their concerns are. And that will tell me a lot of information about how I can help them get there where they want, and also prioritize things on my end. So the more you speak the language of your stakeholders, and that you can only do by getting involved in conversations with them, the better. To me, that helped me a long way. And I remember the early conversations with many of my stakeholders, like, I don't know, product marketing. I didn't understand half of the metrics or the acronyms they were using. But in time, you start, getting used to it. You start understanding why they are discussing what they are discussing. And that will help you tailor your message perfectly when the right time comes. So I think, to me, that helped me a lot. And I would never recommend that enough.
Oh, yeah, no, it's actually excellent advice, actually, yeah. And again, communicating with the stakeholders all the time and understanding their point of view, it's crucial. A little bit of empathy as well. I try to make the extra effort. And okay, so I don't know if you have anything else that you would like to add on the topic. Otherwise, we can wrap up for this.
No, I think
episode.
We covered pretty much it. It was a great conversation, and I hope the audience can get some valuable information from our conversation.
Oh, I'm sure they will. And it was really excellent to have you back again. Thanks. Thank you so much, Nicola. Have a lovely day.
Yeah, you too. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help companies translate their content into results. Get in touch if you want to know more. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. See you next time.